Every time I hear Psalm 23, I am reminded of Cynthia from my previous congregation. Cynthia was an honest-to-God shepherd and owned 1,000 head of sheep. Whenever she would hear that psalm, she'd go, "The sheep may not be in want, but I sure am." That has nothing to do with my sermon. I'm not even preaching from that text. I'll be preaching from Matthew chapter 22. I find that I am sighing a lot lately. You know, you turn on the news and you see the condition of the world and heavy sigh. Or you look at your to-do list and all the things that are undone and heavy sigh. Or you look at any number of things going on in your life, the people you have to deal with and wrestle with, and just heavy sigh. I don't think I'm alone in this, and I've been reflecting on why is this going on, and why do I feel this way? And the conclusion I've come to is that given all that's going on, it doesn't seem like anything's going to change. You see conflicts in the world, and they just seem to be unending. They just seem to keep going on and on and on, and nothing changes. Or that to-do list that I spoke of, well, it never gets any shorter. I've noticed that about lists, right? They never get any shorter. As soon as you cross one off, two more things get put on the list, right? It never changes. It seems like the people you're fighting with don't change, and I desperately want them to change. Of course, the trick there is I want them to change in the way I think they should change, but that's another matter. So a whole lot of things in the world that just seem like they won't change and they can't change. And from there, I have discovered that out of that attitude comes a whole bunch of routes that we really don't want to go down. Out of feeling like the world can't change, that leads you to despair. And feeling like the world won't change and can't change, well, that leads us to be quite harsh and cruel to people who are asking for help and asking for our generosity and asking for aid. We can't help those people over there because the world's not changing and there's only enough for us and for me and mine. And we can't help those people over here who need our help because the world's not changing. There's nothing we can do. Out of that despair comes harshness and greed and all sorts of suffering. And it's all because we don't believe that things are going to change. In our parable today, you have to understand who Jesus is talking to. Jesus is talking to the chief priests, and this all takes place in that week between Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday, that Holy Week. Jesus has marched in to the temple. He has marched in with the crowd that was hailing him as king on Palm Sunday, and he has occupied the Temple Mount. This is like Occupy Wall Street, but on steroids. And the chief priests really do not like this. The chief priests do not like this change that has happened. They want Jesus to go away so things can go back to the way they were. And so they keep challenging Jesus. And so Jesus keeps telling parables at them. And so you have to understand that to understand why the parable sounds so hostile. Jesus sounds downright mean in this parable. But you have to understand that's because he is speaking to people who are hostile to him. So Jesus tells this story, the parable of the wedding banquet. A king throws a wedding banquet. This part is fairly standard. The number one metaphor that Jesus uses for the kingdom of heaven is the wedding or the wedding banquet. And if you're wondering why, just think about this. What's better than a good wedding reception? Right? So a king throws a wedding banquet, and at first he invites all his friends. He invites all the people of his class, his fellow kings, his fellow princes, lords, all that kind of stuff. And yet those people don't want to come. Those people don't just not want to come, they actively reject the king's invitation and do what they can to insult the king. So the king says, fine. We'll move on to other people. And so he tells his slaves, go out into the streets and invite everybody, both good and bad, and just invite them all. Welcome them all in, from the lowliest beggar to the businessman down the road. Invite them all to the wedding banquet. This is, of course, a good metaphor for God. The God who invites all, both good and bad. The God who goes out and his grace is sent to all, both good and bad. Both the people we know and recognize and the people we don't, the people we are familiar with and the people we aren't, the people who we think deserve it and the people who don't. They are all invited. So all these guests come to the wedding banquet, and for the rest of the parable to make sense, you have to understand about the ancient world that when somebody invited another person of a different social class than them to a wedding, that the person who was inviting, the host, that person would provide clothing for the people that they had invited, right? This isn't like weddings today where you've got to go to Men's Warehouse and rent the tux, right? Right? You know, you don't go out. The Men's Warehouse comes to you in this case, right? That the host would provide the clothing. This is really key to understanding this parable, because what it says next is the king notices a guy who's not wearing his wedding robe. He's just come in his jeans. And the king says, friend, how did you get in here without a tux? How'd you get in here without a tie? Because it's not just that this guy came without the proper attire, it's that he's actively rejected what the king has provided. He has actively rejected what the king has provided. I think, despite how harsh it sounds, this parable is actually good news in the end. Because despite the fact that Jesus doesn't use the word, the parable is actually about change. The parable is about a God who issues a generous invitation. An invitation to all, an invitation without qualification, an invitation that you don't have to try out for, that you don't have to be good enough for. Both the good and the bad, everybody in the streets are invited. And not only is everybody invited, but everybody is then offered a new pair of clothing. That the king provides the change which is necessary for this wedding banquet. The king provides a change of clothes. And I think this is good news because we live in a world that we don't think can change, and we are desperately looking for some things to change. And so Jesus tells us that they can change. Not only can they change, but that God is providing the change. God is providing the change of clothes. If you think about it, this is what we believe. This is the heart of what the gospel is, that Jesus Christ enters death on the cross, and yet in that very moment, death is changed to new life. And if you pay attention at your baptism, whether it's your own or your kids' or your grandkids' baptism, you will hear me say these words. I will say that we have been clothed with Christ in the waters of our baptism. That change from death to life, well, guess what? We get a new set of clothes too. We get a new wedding robe. And things are changed from death to life. And so God is working this change of clothes in this world. God has invited us to this wonderful grace, and God is working this wonderful change. And so the only question then going forward is this: what change is God working in you? What change of clothes has God begun in you? Now notice, you got to be really clear about this, because I said, what change is God working in you, not what do you need to change. Because if you're like me, I've got a whole list of things I need to change in my life, and they never get changed, right? I know I need to walk more and be healthier. Guess what? That never happens. We all got this long list of things I know, and yet they can't quite manage to be changed because we can't do it on our own. You know you need to be freed from that addiction and give up that substance. You know you need to be less mean or less petty. You know you need to make those changes. They never quite happen, but I'm not asking that question. What I am asking is this: what change is God working in you? What new set of clothes is God giving you after he's given you this wonderful invitation? Now, just because God's doing it doesn't make it any less work. It's still hard, right? We're Lutherans. We don't like change. Whether we're doing it or whether God's doing it, we still don't like it. But God is working a change in you. It might be the change that God keeps putting this person that you don't like in front of you so that you can be generous and forgiving to them. It might be a change of welcoming somebody you really don't want to welcome. It might be the change of listening to somebody's perspective that you really don't want to listen to. But it's a change that God is working in you. What change is God working in you? That change will involve death to new life. It always does. It does for Jesus, it will for us. You were promised it at the waters of your baptism. And in those same waters, you were promised a new set of clothes. You were promised new life. You were promised a wedding robe to go along with the wedding banquet. I may be sighing a lot more at the state of the world, and yet, God is working change. And thanks be to God for that. Amen. We have another anthem, so you may stay seated. Right? Oh, ignore that. Please stand. I don't know what I'm talking about, evidently. I had this nightmare last night that I was totally lost in my own service, and guess what? It's coming true today. Our hymn is number 462 in your red books. Now we join in celebration, 462.